At the beginning of 1944, 6 divisions of the German Army Group South, some 56,000 men, were encircled by the Russian army. They were stuck in a pocket of around 48 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep around the Ukrainian town of Korsun in the southwest. What followed was a desperate fight of the Germans fighting against the encirclement of Soviet forces outnumbering them. Eventually, the situation got so bad, German General Wilhelm Stemmermann decided to group all the German combat troops inside the pocket, arrange them into 2 columns, and force a breakout of the Cherkassy pocket straight through the surrounding Soviet lines. Once the German forces under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South had retreated back into Ukraine from Russia in late 1943, the Russian Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov realized the potential a certain strategy had. He planned to encircle the German army, just as the Soviets had done at Stalingrad against General Paulus's army, in order to crush the Germans. With diligent planning and quick mobilization, the Soviets rushed their troops, some 80,000 men, to encircle the German pocket located near the city of Cherkassy. Commander of the German forces inside the Cherkassy pocket was General Wilhelm Stemmermann. German forces inside the pocket consisted of 56,000 troops, 30 operational tanks and over 200 artillery pieces. On January 24th, at dawn, the Red Army launched their attack against the German troops. Thing is, the encirclement of the Germans, as was planned, wasn't yet complete. Nevertheless, Soviet General Ivan Konev led the attack with his 2nd Ukrainian front. At first, a massive artillery barrage lasted for several hours. The battalions of the 4th Guards and 53rd Armies followed up, and throughout the day they broke through into the German forward positions. Up to 5 kilometers of depth was won. The next day, Konev's troops launched an infantry attack at dawn. Later that day, the 5th Guard Tank Army, an elite tank division under the command of the highly capable General Pavel Rotmistrov, launched an attack at the base of the Cherkassy pocket. The Germans managed to halt Rotmistrov's advancement with heavy anti-tank fire, but the next day the northern line of the Cherkassy pocket was breached by General Nikolai Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian front. Here too the tank division took a lead role, namely the 6th Guards Tank Army under General Andrei Kravchenko. The Germans managed to hold the breaches by the Soviets and fought for their dear lives. All the while the Soviets managed to establish several strong points around the German troops. By the end of January, the Soviets managed to establish both an outer and inner encirclement of the Cherkassy pocket. The 5th Guards and 6th Tank Armies, reinforced with rifle divisions, stood ready to fight the tanks of 2 German Panzer Corps from the outside. They were desperately trying to break through the Soviet lines to come to the aid of the Germans trapped in the pocket. The conditions inside the pocket started to deteriorate rapidly. Now, the Germans were trapped in an area that housed several villages and forests, yet the area also had many ravines, marshland, and streams of the Dnieper. Although it was still winter in Ukraine, a sudden thaw turned large parts of the area into a muddy mess. The Germans were rather immobile within their pocket. Landing zones washed away due to the thaw, and as such, air support was impossible. Then again, the Soviets surrounding the pocket would fire at any aircraft approaching the area anyway. Ammunition and petrol supplies ran low, unable to be restocked. Germans guarding the front lines of their pocket were subject to a near 24-hour-a-day broadcast of Soviet propaganda, urging the Germans to surrender. It wasn't just Red Army commanders and soldiers that delivered the propaganda, though. German generals that were captured often were made to broadcast appeals to German soldiers to surrender. Considering the situation the Germans found themselves in, when the Soviet forces began to launch direct attacks against certain weak points in the pocket's defenses, the Germans were quickly pushed back. When scattered Belgian SS formation, the Wallonian Brigade, approached the small settlement of Moshny, they witnessed from close by German artillery firing point blank at waves of Red Army soldiers throwing themselves onto their position. Everyone in the village was fighting for their lives, from mud-clogged anti-aircraft guns to drivers, cooks, radio operators, and quartermasters. Abandoned trucks and field kitchens scattered around the area. February 12th, 2 weeks after the Soviets' initial attack on the Cherkassy pocket. At this point, 4 German panzer divisions stationed outside the pocket wanted to breach through the Soviet lines, including the 6th Tank Army that surrounded the pocket. The divisions in the southwest of the pocket near Odessa desperately attempted to break out of the pocket to join forces with the German panzer units. The columns of German trucks, soldiers, and armored vehicles were subject to merciless bombings from the Red Air Force. But a blizzard later that day forced the Soviet aircraft to abandon its bomber missions for now. It didn't matter though. Within 3 days, the pocket was reduced to around 90 square kilometers, with its front line rapidly decreasing. German forces desperately holding the lines were pushed back by the vast amount of Red Army soldiers throwing themselves at them. Of the Germans still inside the pocket, only 1/3 were soldiers. There was barely any shelter, and aside from the psychological torment the men must have gone through, I mean constant shelling, bombarding Red Army infantry on a suicide mission, and German generals broadcasting their pleas for you to surrender. But the physical conditions were horrible as well. It was cold, mud caked to the soldiers, and wherever you'd look, there was at least several bodies lying around. General Stemmermann, who had been trying to get relief forces to come to the aid of his troops since the beginning, now frantically tried to organize his best fighting units. The SS Panzer Division Viking was among them. He rounded up his forces and did what he thought was their only option: break out to the west, through Lysankya, towards the German 3rd Panzer Corps. General Stemmermann ordered the destruction of all vehicles except for tanks, self-propelled guns, tracked vehicles, and enough horse-drawn wagons to carry the wounded. Over 1,000 wounded were left behind though, as there simply was no capacity to bring them along. The breakout was organized in 2 columns, and by the night of the 16th of February, the 3rd Panzer Corps managed to come closer from outside the pocket, towards the point where Stemmermann and his units were going to break out. Just before midnight, February 16th, the breakout was launched, and as snowstorms raged on over the troops, Stemmermann's columns started to move. 2 Soviet armies, the 27th and 4th Guards, were waiting for the Germans. Due to a miscommunication, Stemmermann wasn't informed about the fact the hill they had to pass was occupied by the Soviets. At first, the Germans seemed to be doing well, but it soon deteriorated into complete chaos. The SS Viking Division Panzer Grenadier Regiment came under fire and was forced south to the 15-meter-wide river, the Gniloi Tikich. Under pressure from the barrage of fire by Soviet artillery, many saw the river as their only means of escape. Panicking, some men ran into the ice-cold water, or others used tree trunks as makeshift rafts. Hundreds of Germans died, whether they were swept away by the stream or by hypothermia. That wasn't the end of it, though. As the rest of the German columns emerged into open country, the columns behind the Viking Division were flanked by Cossack cavalry and tanks. Both the rear and flanks of the columns breaking out of the pocket were set upon by both. Those that raised their hands in surrender to the Cossacks were cut down by their sabers. On the banks of the Gniloi Tikich, troops were struggling to cross the river. They were bombarded by Soviet artillery, while Soviet tanks flanked them on both sides and the rear. The SS Viking Division had fallen apart, and for most Germans, they just tried to get away as soon as possible. During the breakout, the car of General Stemmermann was hit by a Soviet anti-tank gun. With him, around 28,000 Germans in total died, were wounded, or were captured by the Soviets during the siege of the pocket. Some 30,000 German soldiers managed to break out though, of whom 6,000 men were of the SS Panzer Division Viking. Lieutenant General Theobald Lieb assumed command after Stemmermann's death, though the SS divisions that had disintegrated to the degree that most soldiers had left behind their weaponry and simply attempted to get away from the battlefield. On screen is footage from a German newsreel from 1944 where Theobald Lieb is given a medal by Hitler for his role in the Cherkassy Breakout. The Soviets suffered around 75,000 casualties, of whom around 1/3 were killed. The Red Army commanders received personal congratulations from Joseph Stalin, and Konev was appointed as Marshal of the Soviet Union for his role during the siege. Nikolai Vatutin would be killed 2 months later by Ukrainian nationalists, and it would take a little more than a year for Hitler to take his own life and the Second World War to come to an end. It is an interesting tale from the horrors of the Eastern Front, especially because so much effort was put in avoiding this to become the second Stalingrad. Nevertheless, it turned out horrible for the Germans, and it would take little more than a year for General Alfred Jodl to sign the unconditional surrender of Germany. Thank you for watching this video, and is there a person or event from history that you would like to know more about and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time.